A brief history of Paladin seals. Paladin seals are self-buffs similar to warrior stances and hunter aspects, in the sense that you can only use one at a time and they last forever. But they were not always like that. In fact, during vanilla they only lasted 30 seconds. The seal system was introduced right at launch. In beta, Paladins actually had a set of melee skills, and their seal spells became blessing buffs instead. Right at launch, all the melee strikes were removed and the new seal system was implemented. In its original form, the seal system was based around the idea of giving the player access to different, mutually exclusive 30-second buffs, which could, through the judgment spell, be used for various purposes. While the buff was up, it would grant the player specific bonuses, and the judgment spell would consume that buff to do something, depending on which seal was consumed. The player would then recast whatever seal they needed next. For example, a Paladin might cast Seal the Crusader, which increased attack speed at the cost of lower damage. Immediately cast Judgment, which would place a debuff on the target, increasing their holy damage, then cast Seal of Righteousness, which made melee attacks deal additional holy damage, and Judge on cooldown. Judgment of the Righteous just dealt damage, until they had to refresh Judgment of the Crusader. Seal of Command gave attacks a random chance to do an extra 100% damage as holy. This was the only non-baseline seal as a talent in the ret tree. While it was regarded as the most powerful seal, it had a nickname called the Slot Machine because it was incredibly unreliable. Seal of the Crusader increased your attack speed and attack power, but decreased your damage per hit. Overall, it was a slight increase in damage dealt, but not by much. Seal of Righteousness made all your attacks deal small amounts of additional holy damage. Seal of Fury was the original Paladin tanking seal. It had an odd way of adding extra threat by doing additional phantom attacks every time you attacked, that did no damage but gave you threat as if they did. Seal of Justice gave all your attacks a random chance to mini-stun. Judging the seal had a very useful effect, however, in that it prevented NPC targets from fleeing in fear, as they often did, and still do, when their health was low. This was particularly useful in dungeons where a fleeing mob could cause catastrophic chain pulls. Interestingly, the debuff actually rendered the target immune to fear effects entirely, and could be used in PvP to make an opposing player fear immune. Which I don't know why you'd want to do that. Seal of Light would cause the Paladin's melee attacks to heal them. In the beginning, it was guaranteed, and every melee attack would heal the Paladin somewhat. Seal of Wisdom was basically the same as Seal of Light, but for mana instead of health. Judgment of Wisdom also applied debuff that caused all attacks against the target to have a chance to restore the attacker's mana. As a result, it was a pretty good seal for raiding. Patch 1.9 saw a major Paladin revamp, and with it, some seals changed. Seal of Fury disappeared entirely and was replaced with the Righteous Fury buff that functioned as Paladin's threat generation mechanic to this very day. Seal of Command was nerfed from 100% damage to 70%, but other than that, things remain much the same. With Burning Crusade, Paladins were given faction-specific seals. Prior to Burning Crusade, only Alliance players could be Paladins, but with the addition of Blood Elves to the Horde, the Paladin class became available to both sides. In an attempt to keep the factions separate, 2 faction-specific seals were added to the game. Alliance Paladins received Seal of Vengeance, while Horde Paladins got Seal of Blood. Oddly enough, the 2 seals had completely different game mechanics. Seal of Vengeance was the model for today's Seal of Truth. It caused Paladins' melee attacks to apply a stacking dot debuff to the target, which caused holy damage and increased the damage judgment against the target. Seal of Blood functioned like a more reliable Seal of Command. It caused the Paladin's weapon attacks to deal additional holy damage equal to a percent of their weapon damage. Since it scaled off weapon damage and provided consistent damage, as opposed to the wildly inconsistent Seal of Command, it was widely considered to be the best Retribution DPS seal. Interestingly enough, the seal had a backlash damage mechanic, where the Paladin took damage equal to 10% of the damage that the seal dealt as well. Thus, its use could occasionally be dangerous to the player. Burning Crusade also saw the change of seals changing from a 1-minute buff to 30 minutes. At the start of Wrath of the Lynch King, Judgment was removed, and replaced with 3 different Judgment spells: Judgment of Justice, Judgment of Light, and Judgment of Wisdom. The Judgment spell no longer consumed the seal buff. Seals were made non-dispellable, so PvP paladins could finally stop worrying about recasting their seals in combat. The beginning of Wrath also marked the end of faction imbalance. Alliance paladins got Seal of the Martyr, which replicated Seal of Blood's effect, and Horde Blood Knights got Seal of Corruption, to simulate Seal of Vengeance. Also, Seal of the Crusader was removed from the game. In 3.2, Seal of Blood and Martyr were also cut from the game. Seal of Vengeance/Corruption was slightly redesigned to incorporate Blood's damage mechanic into additional weapon damage dealt when the target had a full stack of the Vengeance dot. While the loss of Blood's interesting backlash mechanic was kinda sad, this was overall a great quality of life improvement for paladins, as they no longer had to worry about accidentally killing themselves while DPSing. At the same time, Seal of Command was also redesigned to deal weapon damage on hit, and to cleave multiple targets, making it useful for AoE DPS. All in all, there was the single target DPS seal, Vengeance/Corruption, the AoE DPS seal, Command, the DPS seal that no one used because it wasn't as good as Vengeance or Command, Righteousness, the health regen seal that people only use because of the glyph that made it buff your heals, Light, the mana regen seal that people only use because of the glyph that made their heals cheaper, Wisdom, and the utility seal that nobody used because it was useless, Justice. On top of this, Pallies managed 3 different judgment spells that all applied different debuffs, but shared the same cooldown. In Cataclysm, seals became on/off buffs, no longer having a 30-minute duration that needed to be refreshed. The clunky, multiple judgment spells were replaced with a single judgment that basically just dealt damage. Seal of Command was removed, and Seal of the Righteousness was redesigned as the AoE damage seal. Seal of Vengeance and Seal of Corruption were removed and replaced with Seal of Truth. Functionality really didn't change, just the name, since keeping faction-specific spells when the reason from them had long since been removed didn't make a lot of sense. Seal of Light and Seal of Wisdom had their effects merge into a new single self-heal regen seal called Seal of Insight. Insight also found a new niche as a tanking seal, as the self-heals were suddenly powerful enough to be useful for survivability, and the Vengeance mechanic made threat almost a non-issue. Seal of Justice was redesigned so it no longer stunned, but instead applied some holy damage and the movement speed reduction debuff that Judgment of Justice had previously done. Mist of Pandaria brought possibly the most Azeroth-shaking change to the seal system since its implementation all those years ago. Judgment, that ancient staple of the Paladin arsenal, was removed completely and replaced with Judgment. No, seriously, in-game it was spelled right. It wasn't spelled right for 7 years. In Mist, someone finally removed the extra E from Judgment and replaced it with Judgment. They also redesigned Seal of Justice again so that it functioned as a reliable snare instead of a speed limit. Seal of Insight got some healing buffs integrated directly into it, as well as the health/mana regen functionality. And in a move that I think was calculated precisely to make sentimental old paladins tear up, Seal of Command returned to the game as a level 3 spell that eventually gets replaced with Seal of Truth. There is also a glyph that allows you to change your Seal of Truth icon into Seal of Blood, if you're into that kind of thing.